Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics. I have got a treat for you today because we are going to take a look in this video at some of the best language you'll ever read in literature. We're taking a look at one of the best speeches, in my opinion, from all of Shakespeare's works. And if you're not into Shakespeare, do not let that put you off. You will enjoy this video. It will be worth every minute of your time, because when Shakespeare decides to put words in the mouth of a noble person, the effect is outstanding. When that noble person is a real bad guy, it's literally mesmerizing. Now, the person we're going to be looking at is the famous bad guy Richard III. However, this is not from the play Richard III. This is when he is Duke of Gloucester in the play Henry VI. And this is where we first get our inclination of just how broodingly wicked and Machiavellian this guy is. He is the epitome of the intelligent bad guy that is so menacing in the background. And I have to say, I do believe Richard held some fascination for Shakespeare. I think he had a particular love of this character when he was making him because he's so colourful. Now, let's dig in, shall we? So before we start, I just want to say, if you're studying Richard III at school or in college, you're going to want to save this video and watch it again, because it will get you extra points by showing your understanding of the main character in Richard III by referencing a play that comes before, where we find the development of his wicked character. If you're new to Shakespeare and you're tempted to move on, please don't. Because when you understand the flow and rhythm of Shakespeare and the beauty of his words, he is magnetic and becomes quite addictive, and it will make you smile. You're going to see the sort of arc of a character who gets really low and despondent and then comes out the other side feeling quite confident. Now, a bit of background just before we go into this speech. Richard is the Duke of Gloucester. He is one of 4 brothers. His eldest brother Edward is the king. Then there's Clarence, then there's Henry, and then him. Now, Richard is somewhat deformed or malformed and has a disability. That goes against him. But also, he wants to be king. He wants power. But with 3 brothers in front of you, what are your chances of being king? And this is what he's about to discuss to the audience. He's going to let us into his thoughts and his plotting, scheming ways. So, just pick up my book here. This is the complete histories of Shakespeare in this book. I think you can just see behind me up there, just on top, there's the complete tragedies and then the complete comedies. So it's a nice big collection. We're in Act 3, Scene 2 of the play Henry VI, because Henry VI was the king before Edward, who is currently king at this point. And yeah, if you want to follow along, if it fits, I'm going to put the whole transcript in the description so you can just follow along as we go through this. We're going to take it almost line by line so that you can understand everything he's saying, and then afterwards, let's read it. Although I'm not an actor, let's read it and enjoy the flow of the words. Please stick around for this video. It's so worth it. Right. So, what's just happened? We've had King Edward. He's talking about someone that's recently been taken to the Tower. If they're executed, I think. And so he says, go and treat the widow, treat her honourably. And then they walk out, leaving Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest of the brothers. And he now lets us into his mind, his thinking, his despondency at not ever being able to be king. Just listen to this. I, Edward, will use women honourably. So already he's scoffing at Edward treating this widow honourably. He doesn't have, he thinks women are soft. He's all about being manly, battle-hardened. You know, he just doesn't like anybody. And then he says, would he were wasted, marrow, bones and all, that from his loins no hopeful branch may spring, to cross me from the golden time I look for. What does he mean here? He's like, yes, you do treat women honourably. I wish you'd be a bit of a wencher. Because it is known, if you slept around a lot, you caught sexual transmitted diseases, which could waste the body away. That's why he says, I would that he were wasted. Marrow, bones and all, right down to the depth. Why does he want his older brother to waste away? He says, so that from his loins no hopeful branch may spring. his brother who is king doesn't have children yet. And of course, if he has a child and then Edward dies, his child will become king. So that would be a kid that's in the way of Richard ever getting to the throne. He says, I wish he was wasted away from some sexually transmitted disease by being dishonourable to women. And then he wouldn't have any kings, any kin or offspring. And he says, who would cross me from the golden time I look for. The golden time is he wants to be king. And if Edward has children, it will cross his path. It will cut his path off from becoming a king. Let's carry on. He says, and yet, between my soul's desire and me, the lustful Edward's title buried, is Clarence, Henry, and his son, young Edward, and all the unlooked-for issue of their bodies to take their rooms ere I can place myself. So what's he saying here? He's saying, right, yeah, between me and the throne, even if Edward was dead and didn't have offspring, there is still my older brother Clarence and my older brother Henry. So if Edward dies, Clarence would be next in line for kingship. If Clarence died, there would be Henry. And if Henry died, he has his own son, Edward. So I'm in a real pickle at getting to the crown because there's 5 people in line succession to the crown. And he says, and, if you look, he says, and all the unlooked for issue of their bodies. What does that mean? Well, your issue is your children. Unlooked for, it's children that have not yet been born. You know, if these guys stay alive, they're all eventually going to have children, and they will be ahead of Richard for a claim on the throne. So he's really miserable. And then he says this thing here. He says, a cold premeditation for my purpose. Okay? So a cold premeditation for my purpose. This is typical Shakespeare. We have got a double entendre here. Because premeditation means a thought in advance of something. And so what he's saying is the idea that all these people stand in the way of the crown, between me and the crown, that's a cold thought for my purpose. Okay, if I think about that, that really, I can't get to my purpose of being king. But it also insinuates, it lays the first basis for insinuating he is going to premeditate or plan a way to the crown. So there's a play on words in that sentence. Shakespeare does this all the time, and it's so effective because sometimes you only see the one meaning, but there's a tenor, underlying feeling which doesn't escape your subconscious, which builds your sense of unease around certain characters. So, he's miserable because he's cut off from ever getting to the kingship. He says to himself, after thinking of this, why then I do but dream on sovereignty. Okay, the idea of being king is just a daydream. It can never, ever happen. I dream of being sovereign. I'm being thoroughly unrealistic when I consider all these people in between me and the throne. And then he gives us a nice little illustration. He says, why then I do but dream on sovereignty, like one that stands upon a promontory and spies a far-off shore where he would tread, wishing his foot were equal with his eye, and chides the sea that sunders him from thence, saying he'll laid it dry to have his way. So what's all that mean? Let's just break it down. It's very easy, so don't get worried about it. He's saying, I dream, it's just a dream of me ever becoming the sovereign. It's as if I'm like a person on a promontory. So a promontory is a bit of land that sticks into the sea. And I'm stood high looking and I can see a far off land. So across the sea you can see just the edges of land, some unknown land. And he said, where I would tread. So I see this person sees it from a promontory and he would love to be over there to walk upon it. And he says, wishing his foot were equal to his eyes. What a beautiful line. Wishing his foot were equal to his eyes. In other words, his eyes can already be at the land. He can see it. He wishes his feet could be there too. And because he can't, because the sea's in the way, this person on the promontory chides or tells off or castigates the sea that sunders him from thence. Sunders, cuts him off. So he says, me dreaming of sovereignty is like a man standing on a cliff top, looking across a big sea and seeing a little bit of land and wishes he could tread there, and starts telling the sea off because the sea cuts him off impossibly from reaching that land. That's the situation he is in trying to ever get to the crown. And he says, the man on the promontory tells the sea off and says, I'll lay you waste and be able to walk across you, sort of dry you up. Well, is that ever going to happen? No, it's not. Is he ever going to be able to get past all these people between him and the throne? No. He's cut off by a sea from his goal. And then he brings it back to himself and he says, so do I wish the crown being so far off. I can see it, but it's so far away from my grasp that I'm no better than this man stood on the cliff top telling the sea off. And he says, and so I chide the means that keeps me from it. He chides, he bitterly talks to himself about his brothers. And so I say, I'll cut the causes off. So I'll kill them, I'll get rid of them and all their issue. And he says, flattering me with impossibilities. Just as it's so impossible for a man to stand on the cliff top and say he will dry the sea up so that he can get to the land he sees. It's impossible. I talk about it, but it ain't ever gonna happen. So you can see he's completely despondent. So he changes his thoughts. My eye's too quick, my heart o'erweens too much, unless my hand and strength could equal them. So his eye, his desire to get something. His heart thinks too long and dreams and holds on to the desire of being king too much, unless he had a hand powerful enough to wage war against them and take them all out. He doesn't have the power to equal his ambition. And then he finishes with, well, say there is no kingdom then for Richard. So you can imagine him kicking a stone as he says this, the audience watching. Well, say there is no kingdom then for Richard. I may as well give up that dream. So, what does he say next? He says, what other pleasure can the world afford? Since I can't be king, what other pleasures can I get in life? And this is what he says. I'll make my heaven in a lady's lap, and deck my body in gay ornaments, and witch sweet ladies with my words and looks. So, if I can't become king because it's impossible, there's too much in my way, what else can I do in life? I'll make my heaven in a lady's lap. So, the implication, laying your head on a lady's lap in love, but also laying in a lady's lap in carnal intercourse. He says, I'll deck my body in gay ornaments, happy, beautiful, splendid. I'll deck myself out in finery and impress everybody. And then he says, I'll witch sweet ladies, witch. So he'll flirt with, cajole and, have some one-night stands. He'll get his luxury and his pleasure in that. And then he says, oh, miserable thought. Oh, miserable thought. Why is it a miserable thought for him to spend time with women and becoming, rich and wealthy and good to look at? Well, he tells us. He says, oh, miserable thought, and more unlikely than to accomplish 20 golden crowns. Now, if one crown is hard enough for him to get, impossible, he's saying it's more unlikely that he could lay in a lady's lap, bewitch women, look amazing for everybody to idolise. He says it's more unlikely that he could do that than get 20 crowns, and we know one is impossible. Why is it unlikely? He says, why, love forswore me in my mother's womb. Love which makes you beautiful forswore. In other words, abandoned him in his mother's womb. He likely was born premature, unfinished, scarce half made up, as he would say at the beginning of Richard III. And for I should not deal in her soft laws, in love soft laws, so that I can't deal in love, so that I can't bewitch sweet ladies. She did corrupt frail nature with some bribe, to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub, to make an envious mountain on my back, the hunchback, where sits deformity to mock my body, to shape my legs of an unequal size, to disproportion me in every part like to a chaos or an unlicked bear whelp that carries no impression like the dam. And am I then a man to be beloved? Well, monstrous fault to harbour such a thought. Right, let's just break that down. You probably understood that, but what a brilliant way of stacking, this is rhetoric, stacking ideas of how deformed and ugly he is, and hence why he can't find pleasure in wooing women and looking splendid. Even if he wore the best clothes, he would still look an idiot, because, let's break it down, love forswore me in my mother's womb. So where love should take care of forming a child, beautifully in the harmonies of nature, he may have come out prematurely. In fact, he says before my time in Richard III, so he was premature. So it means if you were premature, maybe the body hadn't finished developing. And then he says that love corrupted frail nature with some bribe. Okay, it's as if nature, which forms you, was bribed not to finish this boy properly. And how does he look? He says, to shrink mine arm up like a shrub. So he has a smaller arm one side of his body. To make an envious mountain on my back, a hunch. You probably know that he's called a hunchback. And some have said that this is just Shakespearean or Elizabethan propaganda to sort of wipe out the past of their enemies. But when King Richard III was found in the car park in Leicester, my goodness, did he have severe scoliosis, which likely would have lifted at least one shoulder. Maybe Shakespeare exaggerated it a bit, we don't know, it's likely, but he did actually have a small raised shoulder. And he says, where sits deformity to mock my body? So this is a deformation and it mocks my body. If he's got a hunch, he can't wear nice clothes. It would still be obvious that he's not something splendid to look at. It says to shape my legs of an unequal size. He has one leg shorter than another, which can happen with severe scoliosis. And to disproportion me in every part, probably over-exaggerating. And what does this mean? Like to a chaos. So a chaos, it's not harmonic, symmetrical, it's all over the joint. Or an unlicked bear whelp. The runt of a pack. Think, when the cubs are born for any creature, the parent, the mother, licks them, cleans them, takes care of them, but the runt gets overlooked. So he says, I'm an unlicked bear whelp, whelp being a cub. And it says, that carries no impression like the dam, looks nothing like the mother. Okay, and they knew in those days, they did bear baiting. So bears might have a cub, there was often a runt in the pack, and it was just left to die and no one wanted it. And he says, that's what I'm like, I don't look like a human. And so he says, monstrous fault to harbour such a thought. I am like a man who can see a distant land and want to be there, but the sea cuts me off. So I am someone who stares at being king, but this whole group of people between me and the crown, they cut me off, and I stamp my foot and I say I'll lay it waste, but it's stupid, I can't do that. So I'll be a lover instead. I'll woo women and look amazing. Oh, don't be stupid, Richard, you can't do that. That's more unlikely than becoming king, because you've got a hunchback, deformed leg, shriveled up arm. You're like a chaos. No one's going to like you like that, so give up that thought. And now this is where Richard becomes amazing. He's all despondent at this point and very eloquent with it, almost comical. And then watch the change of mind, the sheer force of personality in Richard develop, which will come out in Richard III. So he says, then since this earth affords no joy to me, but to command, to check, to overbear such as are a better person than myself, I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown, and whiles I live to account this world but hell, until my misshaped trunk that bears this head be round impaled with a glorious crown. What is he saying? You may already sense what he's saying. Well, since I can't woo women and look great, do you know what? Since I'm a character that can only overbear, command, what does he say? Check. He's a good politica. He can stop people getting what they want. He likes to command people, and he has a force of personality that does it. He is a duke after all. He can overbear those who are better than himself, so he can manipulate people. Since I can do all that, I will set my heaven, because he said, shall I find heaven in a lady's lap is joy. I will set my heaven on becoming king, because that's far more likely than me becoming a lover. And he says, while he lives on this world, he'll consider the world a hell. So his heaven is being king, this world is a hell, until his misshaped trunk that carries his head, bears his head. He says, be round impaled with a glorious crown. Well, impaled it can mean something stuck through, but impaled means a palisade, to be surrounded by a palisade, impaled within. So it's the crown, impaling or surrounding his head on his deformed body. So he wants to be king. And then, now he's made his decision, he gets to thinking. And look what he says next. And yet I know not how to get the crown, but I don't know how to get this crown. So how can I set it as my heaven, my goal? I don't know how to get there. So much between me and the crown. How do I get there? For many lives stand between me and home. Home being his target. Too many people between me and the crown. And I, like one lost in a thorny wood that rends the thorns and is rent with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way, not knowing how to find the open air, but toiling desperately to find it out, torment myself to catch the English crown. So he gives us another illustration, another simile. How do I get the crown? There's too many people between me and it, so much so that I'm like a person who's gone into a thorny wood. So he's gone off the beaten track by accident into brambles and thorns, and he's trying to get through, so he rends the thorns. Rend means to cut clear, so he's fighting to get somewhere, but he's also being rent or cut by the thorns. And he says, not knowing how to find open air. I'm fighting, I'm trying, I'm thinking how to get there, but I'm also being stabbed myself by all the thorns and obstacles around me. I can't find open air. I don't have a clear direction to the crown. He's seeking a way, but straying from the way, he says. I'm trying to get there, but frequently my plans go the wrong direction. I mean, how do I get to the crown? And he says, and from that torment, so torment actually in Greek is jailer. He's imprisoned in this problem. He says, from that torment I will free myself or hew my way out with a bloody axe. So, I am stuck trying to get to this crown. I can't find the way out. I'm seeking a way and straying from it. But you know what? I am going to find my way out. I'm clever enough. Remember he said, I can command, check and overbear those who are better than me. He is cunning. And if he can't do it by cunning, he swears to do it by his power of his hand and arm, which he said he couldn't do earlier, but I'll try it. He says, I will hew my way out. If he had an axe, he could chop through the thorny bushes. But he says, I'll hew my way out with a bloody axe. I'll kill to get where I need to go, if that's what it takes. And of course later on he does. And then, after making this decision, an absolute I am going to be king and I'll do whatever it takes, he suddenly inwardly reflects some more and realises he's got certain abilities which really pick him up from this despondency, and you see the absolute magnetism of this bad guy. Listen to what he says. Why, I can smile and murder whiles I smile. In other words, I can smile, I can play the part, and I can murder while I do it. I don't have a conscience. I want something, I can politic, and I can play all graceful and kind and friendship and then kill them while still pretending to be friends. I don't have that problem. Unlike Edward, who says treat the widow honourably. He's not like that. Then he says, and cry content to that which grieves my heart. He can lie. I can say I'm content when something's really annoying him. Remember, he's being rent by thorns. He's being blocked from his goal. I can cry content so everyone will think me good. No one will suspect me of being ambitious for the crown. I can say, oh, I'm content, when actually deep in here I'm grieved. Then he makes some of the most brilliant allusions to literature, ancient literature, in a stack which gives momentum and sheer force to his character, which makes us believe he can do it. And yet he does not do it in this play. Okay? But he's set up to be Richard III. And that's what the whole play of Richard III is about, is him getting to the crown. So, listen to how he now describes his character and the sheer force. He is the typical intellectual bad guy who is so malevolent because of their sheer brilliance. Listen to this. He says, "And wet my cheeks with artificial tears," so he can weep, pretend to weep on behalf of others, and frame my face to all occasions. In other words, change his expression. If someone's angry at something which he's privately happy with, he can show anger to side with that person. If someone's weeping over something, he can weep with them, even if he's glad. If they're laughing and he's angry, he can laugh with them. He can make himself all things to all people so that he's never suspected. And then here are the allusions. He says, "I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid shall. I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon take another Troy. I can add colours to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school." Should just stop there. I'll drown more sailors than a mermaid. The mermaids of ancient Greek mythology, the sirens, used to lure, I said that very weirdly, used to lure sailors onto the rocks and kill them for the pleasure of it. He says, I'll drown more than they ever did. Okay, he'll kill the bloody axe to hew his way. I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. The basilisk, ancient Greek mythology, a snake with eyes which if you looked at turned you to stone. Okay, similar to the Medusa. So he says, those gazing, watching on, he says, I can kill them more than the basilisk ever did in ancient Greece. Then he says, I'll play the orator as well as Nestor. Nestor appears in the Iliad and in the Odyssey by Homer. He's an old and wise character, a bit of a hero, who gives long-winded, sometimes they're funny because he's so long-winded, but he's full of wisdom and he's very persuasive in his speech, which was something the Greeks admired. And here is Richard saying, I'll play the orator like Nestor. I've got a tongue. And you can tell that the way he's talking here, he's got an amazing eloquence. Deceive more slyly than Ulysses could. Ulysses, or Odysseus, but the Ulysses in the Aeneid by Virgil. Ulysses is the one that built the Trojan horse. You know, the horse which some of the Greeks climbed into to get into Troy. So it was Ulysses that devised that. He was known for his cunning and his scheming. So he says that I'll deceive more slyly than Ulysses. Well, it was very sly, the Trojan horse, wasn't it? I can do that. And then he says, and like a Sinon, take another Troy. Sinon links with Ulysses because Sinon was the character who convinced those in Troy to take the horse in, knowing full well that the horse had soldiers in it who would then open the city gates. So, and like a Sinon, finishing it off, I can convince, not only can I speak like Nestor, craft and scheme like Ulysses, I can convince like a Sinon. Then he says, I can add colours to the chameleon. What a brilliant line. A chameleon can shape itself or colour itself to match any background. He says, I can add colours to the chameleon. I'm more skillful at blending in, at playing whatever needs to be played to reach my goal. And then he says, change shapes with Proteus for advantages. Proteus, a water god, a sea god. But it ended up being known by the Greeks as sort of the god of flowing waters and all the shapes water could take to get anywhere it wanted to go. So he says, I can change shapes with Proteus for advantages. So for advantages, he can benefit himself, but also he can probably outdo Proteus. Think of water. It can merge and move wherever it needs to go. It can swell and rise, it can lower, it can gurgle down a hole, it can overwhelm. It's the ultimate shapeshifter. And he's saying, I could change shapes with Proteus and win. If we need to take on different shapes, I'd beat Proteus. And set the murderous Machiavel to school. Well, who's Machiavel? Niccolo Machiavel. He wrote the work The Prince, a great Italian work which advised how a prince can rule over others and keep his position in the court. And it was through some very crafty scheming and with sort of, you had to kill your conscience to a degree. So Machiavel became so famous for his, what's the word? Such brutally honest and open craftiness and conniving to get power, that we today have the word Machiavellian, which is the ultimate scheming bad guy. That comes from Machiavel. And so he says, I can set the murderous Machiavel to school. You know, he wrote this treatise, which was really renowned in its day, still read today. And Richard says, the murderous Machiavel, because he could kill to get his way, he said, I could send him to school. He's nothing on me. So taking all that together, how fabulous is that? You know, I can drown more people than the mermaids, kill more gazers than the basilisk, I can orate like Nestor, I'm more sly than Ulysses, like a Sinon, I can convince people to do things, I can change forms with Proteus, I can give colours to the chameleon, I can teach Machiavel. And now look at this self-congratulated, puffed up ending to a great speech. I love this bit, it makes me laugh. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut, were it farther off, I'd pluck it down. That is great. It's just magnificent. It's saying, actually, I may feel like I'm lost, I may feel like I'm cut off from this crown, but when I think of how good I am at conniving, scheming, doing whatever it takes, and I don't have a conscience, can I do all of that and not actually get to the crown? And then, tut, tush, tut. Even if it was further away, if I had more brothers between me and it, I'd still get it. What a phenomenal bad guy. And we're introduced to him, and he hovers in the background of Henry VI, but he doesn't come to the fore until Richard III. And when he does, he's scheming the death of his brother Clarence, because his other brother, Edward, is dying. And so he knows, and Henry, his other brother, has been killed in battle. So he knows, oh, I'm getting close now. He has got some nephews, which he needs to do away with, but he said here, I'm going to get there. And the way this is written, I believe Shakespeare absolutely loved writing this guy. I think he was charming. I think people, the public, loved him, even though he was the bad guy. And it's quite interesting, considering in Elizabethan days, they needed to make Richard a baddie and hated. I think Shakespeare is very subversive here. People who say, oh, Shakespeare gave Richard a bad name. How can you blame him of that when he had no choice but to paint the Tudor house, the eventual victors, as good, and had to try and paint Richard bad, and yet made him one of the most long-living, beloved characters for his sheer force of will, for his great, grand personality, for his openness in what he wants. I think Shakespeare subtly gave a nod to Richard as being quite a great statesman. So that's the end of that. I hope you enjoyed it. Do not skip, by the way. Do not move on, because we're about to do one more thing. That is the end of going through it. And if you're studying Shakespeare at college or school, go back through this. Okay? Even share this with your teacher so they can share it with the class. The teacher will be grateful because it gives them like half of their class done for the day without them doing anything. So you're welcome if you're a teacher using this. But now what we're going to do, let's just read it. Now that you understand all of it, what's going on, let's just read it. Now, I'm not an actor, so I'm not going to profess that I read this particularly well, but this is where you get the joy of Shakespeare. When you understand him, stand up with the soliloquies before you and read them with as much power as you can. I suggest doing this when no one else is around because you can look quite the fool. But when you do, even if English is not your native language, when you understand it and you express it outwardly with force, you will suddenly understand and feel the flow of the English language like you've never felt it before. And you will feel the emotional effect words have. So here goes as an example. Aye, Edward will use women honourably. Would he were wasted, marrow, bones and all, that from his loins no hopeful branch may spring to cross me from the golden time I look for. And yet, between my soul's desire and me, the lust for Edward, title buried, is Clarence, Henry, and his son young Edward, and all the unlooked-for issue of their bodies to take the rooms ere I can place myself. A cold premeditation for my purpose. Why then, I do but dream on sovereignty, like one that stands upon a promontory and spies a far-off shore where he would tread, wishing his foot were equal with his eye, and chides the sea that sunders him from thence, saying he'll lade it dry to have his way. So do I wish the crown, being so far off. And so I chide the means that keeps me from it. And so I say, I'll cut the causes off, flattering me with impossibilities. My eye's too quick, my heart o'erweens too much, unless my hand and strength could equal them. Well, say there is no kingdom then for Richard. What other pleasure can the world afford? I'll make my heaven in a lady's lap, and deck my body in gay ornaments, and witch sweet ladies with my words and looks. Ugh, miserable thought, and more unlikely than to accomplish 20 golden crowns. Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and for I should not deal in her soft law, she did corrupt frail nature with some bribe to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub, to make an envious mountain on my back, where sits deformity to mock my body, to shape my legs of an unequal size, to disproportion me in every part like to a chaos, and an unlicked bear-whelp that carries no impression like the dam. And am I then a man to be beloved? A monstrous fault to harbour such a thought. Then, since this earth affords me no joy to me, but to command, to check, to overbear such as are of better person than myself, I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown, and whiles I live to account this world but hell, until my misshaped trunk that bears this head be round impaled with a glorious crown. And yet I know not how to get the crown, for many lives stand between me and home, and I, like one lost in a thorny wood that rends the thorn and is rent by the thorns, or with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way, not knowing how to find the open air, but toiling desperately to find it out, torment myself to catch the English crown. And from that torment I will free myself, or hew my way out with a bloody axe. Why, I can smile, and murder whilst I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than a mermaid shall. I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon take another Troy. I can add colours to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut! Were it further off, I'd pluck it down. You gotta love Shakespeare. What a phenomenal... I know I didn't read that brilliantly and I've stumbled in places, but could you feel the movement of his character, the despondency, the coming up and thinking, I've got to go for the crown, and then hang on a minute, I'm determined to get it. And do you know what? Actually, I'm pretty great inside. I can do everything that's needed. Can I do all these amazing things and not get the crown? Pfft, I'm too good. Even if it were further away, I'd pluck it down. It's just the best, okay? And that's Shakespeare at his witty, lovable greatest for me. I think Richard's one of the best characters. Richard III, by the way, and Henry VI, not the best of the plays, but when you read the histories, the speech of the nobles is so good. And Shakespeare gets into them like no one else, and he falls in love with some of his characters. I think of Richard II, I think of Duke of Gloucester, Richard and Richard III, and Henry V, when he finds their character and puts words in their mouth. Nothing in all the others matches, except for perhaps Hamlet. Macbeth, very good. Othello, yeah, good. But just the royalty, the iambic pentameter use in these characters. And by the way, I've got a video on iambic pentameter, which you should watch if you want to get into Shakespeare. He just makes them brilliant. So, if you're practicing Shakespeare or learning Shakespeare, practice him. Read it out loud. Let it infuse your whole body. If English is not your native language and Shakespeare intimidates you, learn it from a video like this, then go away and say it out loud as best you can. And I tell you, the more vigour you put into it, it will move and stir you up like no other piece of English literature can. I wish we had a Shakespeare today. So, that's the end of this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Leave a comment down below and feel free to share it. Until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.